Hi everyone, this is Adam Virgil. In the last video, we gave you the power to control the dates in your chart. And what we ultimately ended up settling on is a formula in our end date, which was getting the maximum date in a data set for the player that we're looking at. And our start date would be also set in a calculation that would be the maximum date minus however many days we want to show up. And in this video, we're going to do a couple things. It's probably going to be on the longer end of things, but I'll go over the order that we're going to do things in. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to add more flexibility to this end date. So we're going to say, if you want the maximum date in the data set for the athlete, you can have it. Or if not, you can enter in a custom date, and you can use either, instead of just having a formula be in this cell. After we do that, we're going to aggregate. We're going to create the same chart for team averages. And then when we're done with that, we're going to figure out how to aggregate the data for a given player, not per date, but a general average or sum over the past 7 days, let's say. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing that we said that we're going to do is we're going to give us some flexibility with this date cell. And the first thing that we'll do here is we're going to insert a checkbox somewhere. And remember, we're going to have a video after this one where we'll organize everything into a nice dashboard. I promise it. You'll be able to make it look really nice. It's ugly right now. I get that. So let's bring down this menu here, and we'll insert a checkbox into this cell. I'm going to move the checkbox over, and maybe I'll call this Use Custom Date. And next to it, and we're already running out of space here. That's okay. Let's move. I'm going to move some stuff over so that you can see it. You don't have to move yours. And we'll have a yellow cell here where we enter in a custom date that we might want to use. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do with this formula in the end date cell currently is I'm going to lock everything in so that it doesn't move at all. A $sign before each of the letters and a $sign before the numbers, and click Enter. Once we've done that, I'm going to copy this formula and I'm just going to paste it over here somewhere. I'll paste it right here in column E. And notice it's exactly the same as the one that we copied. Now, we are still going to have a formula in this end date cell. And the formula will be equals if, this checkbox. So a checkbox, when it's checked, it means true. When it's unchecked, it means false, essentially, behind the scenes. So if this checkbox equals true, comma, then, if that is true, then we want to take the date that is our custom date. But if it's not true, comma, so if it's not true, and let's look at this if statement here. If a logical expression, so if the checkbox equals true, comma, then the value if it's true, which will be the date that we enter in here. So if it's true, we want the date we enter in, comma, if it's false, then we want the maximum date in our data set, which is right here. And we'll close the parenthesis and click Enter. And because this is unchecked, we have the maximum date in our data set. In other words, it is false. If we want it to be true, we click on the checkbox. Now we're using this date, which is essentially nothing. But if we type in a date here, let's say we want to use 12/10/2020, and click Enter. Now that's the date that we use. And if we say, you know what, we want the maximum date in the data set for this athlete, we can just uncheck this box and it'll change back. So we can kind of manipulate things on the fly how we'd like to. That's the first thing that we said that we're going to go over, and we did it. That's great. And what we'll end up doing at the end of this is we'll hide all of these columns. And like I said in the last video, I just want to make sure it's clear. This data collection should happen on one sheet. These formulas and such should happen on another sheet. And these selectors that we have and the actual graph should be on another sheet. Right now we're doing it all on the same sheet so that we can see what's going on. In the last video, we got this data. So we got the information for an athlete between these two dates. To get team averages, we're going to have to do something very similar. We're going to have to get the dates between these two date ranges. And honestly, we don't have to do anything else. We already have this formula here, and that's fine. Except this formula that we have for the athlete, inside of it, we say we want to get all the dates when the athlete in our data set is equal to this athlete. Now, if we just wanted a unique list of dates in our database, let's say that, here, let me backtrack. So let's say that an athlete is not present on a day, and for that reason they don't show up, or there is no, let's say Laquan James wasn't here on 9/2, and therefore they don't show up in the database on that date, then that will not be included in this date list. But when we're doing a team average, we would want the date there anyways, and to get an average there anyways, even if the athlete that we selected is not present, I would assume. So I'm going to highlight all the stuff that we have here, and I'm just going to move it over a little bit, maybe over to here. And that's okay. Our chart is broken. That's okay, because we're going to kind of redo it anyways. So this is fine. Now what we need to do is we're going to do the team averages over here. And the formula is going to look slightly different. Let's see what happens if we go equals sort or equals filter, open parenthesis. We want all the dates, comma, when the dates are not equal to the header row, because we don't want to bring in the name date into this list. And if we close the parentheses and click enter, now look at all these dates. So we have all of our dates, 9/1 to however long it goes, and then it goes through the dates again because it goes through for each player. So what we really want is we just want a unique list of dates. So before the filter function, we'll go unique, open parenthesis, and we can just leave all this as is, just to make sure that we get one of each. And we can close the parenthesis and click enter. And now if we look through our dates, don't worry about this chart. When we look through the dates, we don't get the dates repeated again. Looks like, oh, I forgot to replace the data that I removed for this guy, but that's okay. I'll replace it now. Okay. Now this is very important, and I didn't do it in the last video because of the way that my data is organized, but you should consider it. My data is organized chronologically. Now, that's why these dates show up in order. 12, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. Now, what if we're not in this order? So right now we're looking at the dates between 12/3 and 12/10. I'm going to go over to Laquan James, and what I'm just going to do is I'm going to switch. I'm going to say, 12, we entered data for 12/10, and then we entered it for 12/3 later on, because this is just our database. And we could probably sort this or filter through it. You may do that with filters. Now look what happened to our data. 12/10 shows up before 12/4, and 12/3 shows up at the end. And that will affect the way that our chart looks. So we'll have the first data point be 12/10 when we actually want it to be 12/3. So to get around this, what we do is we add a sort function before all of this happens. And what that does is it just sorts the data. So before the filter, we'll go sort, open parenthesis, and all we have to do is close this off with another one. I don't need to get into the details. I have videos on how the sort function works if you want to go over those. And we can click enter. And now 12/3 is first again. And I'm just going to go back and change it because the data points are, this should have been 12/3, and this one should have been 12/10. Why I brought that up is, number one, because you need to know it, especially if your data isn't collected in a chronological manner, and or you have filters on your data so that you can sort it and filter it in different ways. That'll affect your charts if the dates are not sorted. We need to apply that here as well. So before the unique, we're going to add on a sort. Sort, open parenthesis, all this stuff just to make sure. And click enter. Now we have a unique list of dates, but what we really need is a unique list of dates that are between these two dates, just like we did here. We want this date range to match this date range so that we can look at the players' data and team averages. And my plan, just so you know, is I want to display the fatigue data on one graph, the athlete versus team average, and the training load data on another graph. So the training load, the athlete's training load versus the team average. That's why it's okay if this chart is messed up, because we'll have to do it kind of again anyways. So I'm going to write date up here, just like we did before. I'm going to write team fatigue, team TL, and maybe I'll just call this TL also for short. And these could be any metrics you want. These are just examples. Okay, so the other pieces of criteria in this date formula that we have need to be similar to this one. In other words, we also want the dates, which is A to A in our data set over here, when they're greater than or equal to this date, and also the dates when they're less than or equal to this date. The easiest way to do this, we could rewrite that part of it if we wanted to, but we can just copy what's in here already. I'll hold down Control-C, click the Escape button to get out, and come into this new formula that we're writing. And after this argument in our filter, this is condition 1, we want to get all the dates when the date is not equal to the header row, comma, and I'll Control V on my PC to insert the same information in here, and click Enter. Now our date ranges are the same. Great. To get the average team fatigue and the average team training load for each date, we can use a function called average ifs. So we go equals average ifs, open parenthesis. The first argument is the average range. What do we want to get the average of? Well, in this case, we want to get the average of fatigue. So we want the average of column C. And just like filter, you can add conditions, comma. So condition 1. Well, we want the average of the fatigue, but when what is true? The only condition that we have is when the date, or column A, comma, that's criteria range 1, is equal to criterion 1. And criterion 1 is the date in question, which in this case is this date. And I don't know why it went to the beginning. So we want to get the average of the fatigue values when the date is equal to this date. And let's close the parenthesis and click Enter. So this would tell us the team average fatigue on 12/3/2020 was 5.5. This person's, whoever we selected, was a 1. Now we're going to have to drag this formula down so that it applies to each of these dates. But before we do that, let's lock some things in. So put a $sign before each of the C's, before each of the A's, and before the K, but not the 7. Because when we drag this down, we're going to want to adjust the row because each date is on a new row and we want it to apply to each date. And also before we drag it down, we can say if error, open parenthesis, which means if there's an error with anything going on in this formula, comma, quote, quote, which means blank. If there's an error, then make it blank. And click Enter. The reason why I did that is because when I copy and paste this formula down, I don't want to just copy and paste it for these dates. Because then what happens if we use a different date? Let's say we want to use 12/15/2020. Oops, I guess we're looking at the past 7 days. So what if we want to look at the past 14 days? The formula won't apply. So we need to copy this formula, and I'm going to hold down Shift, Control, and the down arrow to get to the bottom of my sheet, and Control V to paste the formula in. And we can see that the formula has gone into all these cells, and they're blank because we wrote that if error. But when there is data, or when there is a date, we get the data. That's perfect. Now to get the team TL, since we wrote this formula really well, we can copy it and paste it over. And instead of looking at column C now, all we have to do is look at column D with all of our criteria remaining the same. So change column C to column D to D and click enter. And we can copy this formula. And I'm going to hold down Control Shift down arrow on my computer, Control V to paste the formula so that it goes all the way to the bottom. And there we have it. We have our data for the team averages. Now let's fix both of these charts, and then we'll move on to the aggregate data, or the aggregate over a date range data instead of data per date. Here we aggregated it for a group of players, but next we're going to aggregate the information for a group of dates. So let's go back to this chart, and it's all messed up. We might as well actually just create a new one from scratch, but let's go here. Let's edit this chart. I'll move my face. Yeah, actually, let's just create one from scratch because I don't want to do this again. Creating charts is easy. We didn't really do anything. So I'm just going to select this data, except I'm going to go all the way to the bottom. So I'm going to hold down Control Shift down arrow now, go to the bottom, insert chart. I'm going to copy this chart, delete it, and scroll up and paste it. Now, we'll edit the chart and see what it did here. So we have a series called date, but we want that series to be the x-axis. So let's add an x-axis and let's make that date instead. And our series, if we click on it, we want that to be fatigue, or the values. So let's click that. And now we'll see that we have, for some reason, two series called fatigue. So I want to remove one of them. And I want to remove the labels, which just says the player's name. It's by date. And now we have fatigue over time. Now the next part of this is, like I said, I want to compare the player's value to the team average. So if we go to Edit Chart, we can add a series. But before we do that, let's check here. So this is H6 to H1000 for fatigue. We want it to be the same range. So when we add the team fatigue, we want to go L6 to L1000. So we'll edit this chart, add a series, select data from a range, and let's go L6 colon to L1000 and click OK. And now we have a graph with the athlete's fatigue and the team fatigue side by side for each date. And now I might visualize this differently, and I actually would, but let's play around with different ideas just because I think it's good. It'll give you some firepower when creating graphs. We'll do two different graphs just because they'll be different and it'll expose you to different graph types or chart types. But for this one, I'm going to edit the chart and customize. And we can go to the series. And for the team fatigue series, which is red right now, oh, this is not the right chart. So we actually, it automatically made it a column chart. I always go with a combo chart. The reason being is because then you can manipulate the series. What I saw when I went to customize before was I couldn't change what the series looked like. It had to be a column. So I'm going to choose combo chart. And I'll go to customize the series and the team fatigue series. And I like this stepped area. So I'm going to select that. And now, at least for me, I can quickly see which days the athlete had higher fatigue than the team, and which days the team average was higher than the athlete's value in blue. Cool. Okay, so that's one chart. Now, we can create another chart for training load. So let's copy this chart. It's probably the quickest way to do it. And paste it here. And we can edit the chart. we can keep the date field the same, but now instead of fatigue, we're going to want to change this. So fatigue was H6 to H1000. Now we want I6 to I1000 for the athlete's fatigue, or for the athlete's training load now. So if we go to edit chart and click on fatigue, select data range, instead of H6 to H1000, we want I6 to I1000 and click OK. And for team fatigue, let's look at the data range. Instead of L6 to L1000, we want M6 to M1000 because it's the next column over. And we'll click OK. And we'll change, in the next video, we'll change the look of these charts so that they're different, so you get exposure to different things. And this is, so now we have two charts. One is for training load, one is for fatigue. Great. Now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to aggregate the data and create two more mini charts. Okay, so the last two things, hopefully they should be relatively quick, relatively simple, but it's the different way that I was talking about before of aggregating information when using dates. In other words, we're not going to use this filter function, we're going to use a different function to do kind of the same thing, but you'll be able to understand different ways to get data out between date ranges that you select. So we're going to use a function called averageIfs, and I'm just going to find space to put it because I'm telling you, this is not an ideal setup here. There's a lot of stuff going on. I'm going to put it over here. We're going to call this player, let's play player fatigue over past X days, and we'll say player fatigue over previous past X days. I know my names probably couldn't get any more confusing, but what I want to do is I want to get the average fatigue for the player over the previous this many days that we selected using our date ranges. And then what I want to get is I want to get the player average fatigue over the previous this many number of days before that many number of days. So imagine it like this. We select these dates that we have, 12/1 to 12/15, 14 days. I want to get the player's average fatigue over that range. And then I also want to get the player's average fatigue over the 14 days prior to this range. So it would be 11/30, or 30 days has September, April. Yeah, so 11/30 through 11/16, or 11/16 through 11/30 or so. And compare those two things to see what percent change there was between those two time periods. It's just like looking at week-to-week changes in training load or fatigue or whatever, just in a more dynamic way. So to do that, to get the first piece of information, we can go equals averageIfs, open parenthesis. What do we want the average of? Well, we want the average of column C, which is fatigue, comma, and just like filter, we'll add conditions. When what is true? When criteria range 1, or when the player, comma, is equal to criterion 1, which is the player that we select. Now this will give us if we just close this off and click enter, this will give us the player's average fatigue for all time. But that's not what we want. We want their average fatigue within our date range that we selected. So we'll say, comma, and also when, so we want the fatigue for that player, and also when the date, comma, is quote greater than or equal to quote ampersand, and I'll let that sit for a second. And this is just nomenclature in Google Sheets and Excel. After a comma, numerical operators need to be in quotes, and then this ampersand pretty much says, okay, we're done with these quotes, now we want to refer to a cell or a number. So greater than or equal to our start date. Now this value here that we see is the average fatigue for the player that we selected for all dates greater than or equal to this start date. But we also want, comma, the average to be less than or equal to our end date. In other words, the average between these two dates. So, comma, when A to A, or dates, comma, is less than or equal to, in quotes, and ampersand, our end date. That's a lot of stuff. But let's walk through it again. We want the average of C to C, which is our fatigue, when B to B, which is the player name, is equal to the player that we select, and when A to A, which is our dates in our database, are greater than or equal to our start date, and when our dates are less than or equal to our end date, giving us an average within that date range for the player that we select. So let's close off the parenthesis and click enter. Great. And now because I'm going to copy this formula and paste it down, we have a couple of options. Let's lock everything in because it's just good practice. I like to do it so I don't get confused. So I'll put $signs for the C's, for the B's, for the G and the 2 that locks in the player, for the A's, for the G and the 4, before everything, before every single letter and every single number. And when I'm done that, I'll click enter, and then I'll copy and paste this formula down. Now the only thing that we want to change is we don't want the value between our date range anymore. We want the value between our date range minus the number of days that our date range is, so that we're comparing two similar time periods. To do that, all we have to do is, let me go through it again. We want the average fatigue when the player is equal to the player that we select and the date is greater than or equal to the start date minus the number of days in that date range, and we can lock that in with the $signs. And also when the dates are less than or equal to our end date minus the number of days in that date range. And we can lock that in and click enter. Now what this is saying is, over the past 14 days, or between 12/1 and 12/15/2020, the average fatigue for the player that we selected is 4.9. And in the 14 days prior to that, that player's average fatigue was 5.7. So there's been a difference. There's been a 0.8 difference. And I want to display that in a little chart. Maybe it's just a scorecard chart. But before we do that, let's copy these things that we have, everything, the 4 cells, and paste them below. And instead of fatigue, we'll say player TL over the past X days and player TL over the previous past X days, which are the worst names I could have chosen because they're really confusing. And now the only thing that we have to change in these formulas are, instead of average if C to C, which is the fatigue column, we want to average the TL column, or the training load column, which is D to D. So we'll say average ifs D to D, and all the rest stays the same. Enter. And average ifs D to D instead of C to C, and everything else remains the same. Great. Now we can create charts. So I'm going to select these things, or actually maybe just these 2 values, and go to Insert Chart. And Google Sheets will give me a good guess of what it thinks I want. I want not a column chart, but I want a scorecard chart. It's another chart type. So let's select it. And there we get a value. That's great. That's a really good start. So the way that these charts think that the data is coming in and is in columns, like it goes one column to the next. So we need to switch rows and columns here. And now when we do that, this data is accurate. So let's look at this. So their fatigue over the past X days is 4.93. Perfect, that's what we want, big and bold. And the change from the previous 14 days was minus 0.73, or it got lower by 0.73 because the average over the previous 7 days was 5.7. If we edit this chart, the only thing that I want to show you before moving on to the dashboard design phase, with this chart is if we go to customize, there are a lot of design features here, but the one that I want to point out is if we look at the baseline value, we can decide whether we want this to be absolute change or a percentage change. And with values like this, I might do a percentage change. So instead of absolute change, we can select percentage. And now we know that over the past 14 days, the average over the past 14 days is 13% lower than it was over the prior 14 days. Okay, so let's do that. And then what we can do here is we could copy this chart if we wanted to. Usually I do this at the very end because so we don't have to manipulate formatting on two different charts, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we'll copy it, paste it, and we can edit this chart now. Instead of the key value being P7, which is right here, we want it to be P10, and we want the other value, or the baseline value, to be P11. So let's just change that quickly. We'll edit chart. Instead of P7, we'll make it P10. And then instead of P8, we'll make it P11. Click OK. And now we see that, well, this value, or this training load value, is 19.7% higher. Okay, great. We have all of our components here to make a nice dashboard with date selectors and things. And hopefully we learned a lot through this process with date aggregation and getting things by date and controlling dates and charts. So I hope that these two videos were helpful. If you want to stick around and make a dashboard out of this stuff that looks good, we'll do that in the next video. Thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you in the next one.